About 2 years ago, a little less than that, like 22 months ago, I made a video about Factorio uh, shortly after I beat the game for the first time. And it was also shortly after version 0.15 of the game had come out. The game is still in early access. In my video 22 months ago, I said that I expected 1.0 to be out that year, and I seem to think that I'd heard that from the devs. Maybe I was mistaken at the time, but anyway, Factorio 1.0 definitely didn't come out in 2017, but it I don't think that that's a problem. The game has, I think, a really good example of how early access can be done well. I think it's an interesting contrast with Wreckfest, another game that I've made videos about. The Factorio devs are in constant communication with the community around the game. They update the game regularly, and even when they're not updating the game necessarily on a super short timescale, they're always putting out information about what they're working on and why the current phase of the game development doesn't involve as many frequent updates. Um, yeah, they've used early access really well to refine their game, to take in feedback from the community, to incorporate ideas that show up in mods into the game, uh, and to just keep making Factorio better and better. So it is now, he says, as confidently as he did the last time, approaching 1.0. And it's a really good and polished game. So I wanted to make another video and talk a bit about how the game's changed and how the way I play it has changed, because I've beaten the game a lot of times since then. But I've been playing it again a lot recently, as I tend to when a new patch hits. And I beat it with this factory, and I feel really satisfied with this factory in a way that I often don't. Usually factories get sort of abandoned, and you move on to the next idea or the next set of, than just a new map or something like that. But this factory, I was sort of like, actually, maybe this factory is done in a way that I didn't usually feel. So what's changed in Factorio in all this time? Like, well, they've done an art pass on the game. The game looks, I think it looked good before, but it continues to get better with each art pass, which is what art passes are supposed to do. So that's great. The artists on this game are doing a great job. They've rebalanced the game a bunch, as sort of you would kind of expect, I guess, with a game that's in early access and is of this type. Recipes have been changed, things have been shifted around. That was also a good reason to make a new factory, because your old ones kind of don't work anymore. They've changed the map generation a lot, in really positive ways, I think. I really like the way that the game builds maps for you now. I find it, it took me a lot less time fiddling with settings to get a map that let me build the factory the way I want to build it. With this, and also they've done a big UI pass. Some of the UI is pretty much the same, but a lot of it is very different in function, if not necessarily in look. I do like these changes overall. I think they're a little bit annoying in the early game. I think I preferred the old system in the early game, but partly I think that was just me getting used to it. But also, as well as the game changing, my playstyle has changed a lot. From the first time I beat the game. And there are a couple of things that have influenced, like, the way that I designed this specific factory that I'm about to show you. And one of those big influences has been watching Factorio speedruns at some point in the past 2 years. I couldn't tell you when. Fairly recently, I'd say maybe in the past year at some point. I started watching Factorio speedruns pretty regularly, watching streams on Twitch and VODs on YouTube and stuff, and just becoming really interested in the speed aspect of the game, and especially, I think what drew me into it is how competitive the Factorio speedrunning scene has been at certain times, and especially recently, like the last few weeks of the previous patch of version 0.16 was like this really cool, intense period in Factorio speedrunning where two particular runners, Nephrons and Antiolitz, who are sort of the two, I would say, consensus best runners of this game in the world right now, where we're sort of trading records back and forth over the course of a couple months. And I really enjoyed watching those streams, and obviously one of the really fun things about Factorio as a speed game is that as a spectator, you can pick up ideas and builds for your own use in your own game. So there's a lot of speedrunning related things in the build. Obviously, this isn't a speed build, and I don't play the game for speed, but I did beat the game with this factory in I think pretty sure comfortably the quickest time I've ever done it, which is about 30 hours. And again, that's not because I was targeting finishing as quickly as possible. It's just because usually the way I've been building, I don't even try and beat the game until I'm already 60, 80 hours into a factory, just because of the style that I've been building with. So I've been watching a lot of speedrunning. I also at some point in my own play came up with this idea for how to build based on belt speeds, right? Factorio, you do a lot with conveyor belts in Factorio. Once you get to late game, you can replace them with bots a lot, but I still like to play with belts even through to the late game. And you start out with these transport belts, which can move 15 items a second, and then later you get fast transport belts, which move 30 items a second, and express transport belts, which move 45 items a second. Those numbers change slightly in the new patch, but somehow this idea came to me. I think, I guess one of the influences was watching speedrunners and seeing like, oh, they do the entire game with just this first level of belt, right? They beat the game in, less than 3 hours, using only yellow belts, only the most basic level of belts, because, they're the cheapest ones to build, and you don't want to waste resources building the faster ones if you can do it with the slower ones. And so I was like, oh, you can do a lot with these, actually. Like, you don't need to go up to the higher speed belts maybe as early as I like to, because you can do a lot with these ones. So I was like, okay, the way that I'm going to play Factorio is I'm going to make a base with yellow belts, and then I'm going to make a base with red belts, and then I'm going to make a base with blue belts. Like, those are going to be my levels of progression through an individual playthrough of the game. I'm going to start out with a factory that just makes very basic things and uses the most basic level of belts, and I'm going to use that factory to build all the things that I need to make a factory that uses red belts, that's higher throughput, makes higher tier technology packs, gets me deeper into the game. And then my idea was that my blue belt factory, my sort of high tier factory, was going to be a mega factory, quote unquote, a factory that is ultra late game, uses a train network to transport goods over large distances very quickly, and has sort of dedicated modular areas for producing different types of intermediate products rather than a giant bus. So that was sort of like an idea that I was playing with for a lot. I did a lot of maps like that, but I didn't quite do that with this map. I've started with that idea, but I've tweaked it a bit, I guess. One of the other big influences on my playstyle has been using a lot more external tools to play Factorio, and in particular using the Factorio calculator at kirkmcdonald.github.io, which is a really useful tool. So I kind of came up with this idea of trying to make a balanced factory rather than just like trying to balance a factory around a specific requirement, I guess, right? Trying to work backwards from a specific requirement for a specific kind of production goal that I wanted to achieve, and working backwards from there using mostly the Factorio calculator and some other external tools, plus just my own knowledge of the game that I've accrued over a couple of years of playing it, to plan back from that end state to how much production do I need, how much input do I need, how am I going to set that up and make that happen. So yeah, the name of this save file that I'm playing on right now is planning. Like that was what I was doing with this factory, was saying, okay, rather than just going in ad hoc and with this loose idea of like yellow belt factory, red belt factory, blue belt factory, I'm going to plan specifically what scale each of those factories is going to be at around a certain goal. I didn't do it super specifically, but I'm still really pleased with the result that I got from that. So let's start the tour, I guess, and let's start with what is my first factory. So I've sort of gone back around again in playstyle in an interesting way, I think, because when I made my previous video of this game, I was in this playstyle where I would handcraft a lot early on, right? Like I would have an idea in my head of what I wanted my early game factory to look like, and I would handcraft a lot of stuff to build that factory. Once I started watching speedruns, and also once I did one of the achievements in the game, which specifically tries to teach you not to use handcrafting, I started doing a lot more mini factories early on in the game, right? And obviously speedrunning is huge with that, where you're trying to get as much automation going as quickly as possible. So I was really into that for a while, building these really lean early game bases that got you your basic things that you needed to keep expanding quickly. But I've looped back around with this factory to having a fairly grand plan for my early game factory and not deviating from it too much. You'll see some areas here where there are some bits of later upgrades creeping in, but I'll try and give the idea of my early game factory initially. So this is sort of the core of my early game factory. It's not quite running at capacity at the moment because over time I've depleted my initial mining patch, but this is my starting area, right? This is the first patch of iron that I started right next to in the game. And this was sort of the scale that I wanted to build my early game factory around, was 4 sets of iron smelting, 2 sets of copper smelting, and then a pretty big steel setup on the side of it, but all just using yellow belts, and using a layout that is much more speedrun inspired than previous layouts that I've been using. I picked up this style of laying inserters in pairs here, because it's quicker to lay out that way. You just I'll demolish these and relay them really quickly, but you just sort of click and drag, 2 vertical lines like that, and you can lay them down. That's really satisfying to do. I also picked up this style of using inserters rather than 2 sets of splitters in order to get this effect of fuel on one side or on the other side of these belts, because you need fewer technology tiers. You unlock underground belts first, but you don't unlock splitters until later, I think. Maybe I'm getting that wrong. Anyway, no. What I'm wrong about that. It's that you do this with chests at first. That's another little speedrunning trick I picked up, is you build 1 stack of smelters. Obviously, these started out as stone smelters, and I've since upgraded them to steel smelters, which means that if they were getting enough ore, which they're not anymore, this would produce 1 full belt of iron plates, 1 full yellow belt of iron plates, I should say. So yeah, so initially, rather than this belt carrying fuel that's running underground, you just would have a chest here, and you'd fill that with coal. You wouldn't have this splitter here. You'd just be directly running a line of iron from your miners onto one side of this belt there, to produce a lot of iron, to get your iron smelting lines up really quickly. But since then, I've upgraded this a little bit as I've expanded the iron mining here, and I could make this a bit more efficient in terms of balancing ore between steel and iron, but at the time that I built this, it was making enough ore to satisfy this. You can see sort of up here is where all those miners are. I should say I do play with a few mods now. Not as many mods as some people use for this game. Some people mod it very heavily. Obviously, there are some very popular mods out there that completely overhaul the game. I just play with a few very small things that do things that I particularly like. I play with a mod that gives a bit of extra lighting around power poles. See if I take out my night vision goggles, if that becomes obvious at some point. Just because there isn't enough light in the game early on, so I enjoyed that. I play with a mod that makes concrete get automatically laid around your roboports. I complained in my previous video about how much I disliked the process of concreting your base, so that's a really satisfying mod. I also play with a mod called Dirt Path that means that areas that you run around on a lot get brown instead of, you wear the grass out in areas that are heavily trafficked. You can see I've obviously done that here, and that's just visually really satisfying to me. And also, the reason that I was mentioning this, and you can see it right now, I have a mod called Auto Deconstruct installed. That means that once a miner runs out of resources, it gets tagged for automatic deconstruction, which doesn't do all the cleanup for you, because you see there's still things like power poles and bits of belt that get left behind. But yeah, those are the mods that I'm playing with. Anyway, where was I? So yeah, so I planned to lay out this much, iron mining and this much copper mining. I didn't get these all going immediately, but I got at least 2 and 2, I think, going before I really built any more of this factory. This steel setup has been expanded a bit. It was initially shorter, only 12 to a column. And again, this is another sort of speedrun based setup where you can lay this out super quickly. I'm not going to demonstrate, but You just have to take my word for it. But yeah, I've extended this with some upgraded belts. So this playthrough was planned. I had a clear idea of where I was going with it, but at the same time, I decided to not be precious, right? Like I wanted to leave my old factory intact even once I built the next one, but I wasn't going to be precious about, like, if I want to make some quick and dirty upgrades or sort of shoehorn some extra production in somewhere later on, I'm just going to do it. I'm not going to be too precious about sticking to my design in all cases. So yeah, this was my first, this is my first base, and I wanted to make it with 4 lanes of iron, because you do need a lot of iron in the early game, and working with a similar bus concept to one that I've always really enjoyed playing with in this game, but again with this playthrough planning more, so thinking more about how much am I actually going to need in terms of intermediate products on this bus. Do I really need to build to some outrageous scale? So in previous bases I had laid out like 4 red belts of cogs and stuff like that, which is just kind of excessive. Like, you never really are consuming that much unless you're up to scales that I just wasn't building at. So here I was just like, okay, let's be a bit more sensible. Let's have 1 belt of gears and 1 belt of circuits, and that's going to be more than enough. These started out with lower level assemblers. Over time I've upgraded them and put productivity modules in here. There's another cool speedrunning thing that I have been applying here, which is not doing 3 into 2 for circuits. So what do I mean when I say that? When you look at the recipe for electronic circuits, it takes half a second to build one, and you need 3 copper cable to do it. Copper cable takes half a second to make 2. So you do the math, you figure out that what you would think that you would want is 3 assemblers making copper wire feeding into 1 assembler making electronic circuits, and that's a very common way to build. But it turns out that the way that the different assembler speeds work, you can have 1 assembling machine level 1 making electronic circuits be fed by 1 assembling machine level 2 making copper wire, and that is also ratio perfect, just as if you did 3 into 2 with all of them the same level assembler. This probably doesn't make much sense, but whatever, it is how it is. And then again, once you upgrade to assembler level 2s, you can stick a couple of productivity modules level 1s in there, which gives you some free circuits every now and again, but slows down your assembly machine, and that again keeps the ratio not quite perfect, but almost perfect. And I've used this concept again later on, so this just lets you make these factories for green circuits a little bit more compact. Anyway, that's a bit of a sidetrack. So yeah, I built my smelting first, then I built, assemblers to make 1 row of cogs, 1 row of green circuits. With that, you can make yellow and red science, so I did. And then once I'd done that, I could make steel, and once you have steel, you can make military science, so I did. This part came later. So I made military science, and I did that, and then that's usually where I would stop with my yellow belts in like previous playthroughs that I'd been doing with this yellow belt base, red belt base, blue belt base concept. I would stop at this point and then wouldn't do oil processing and things like that until I was building my red base. This time I decided not to do that. I decided, you know what, I'm going to do a bigger yellow belt base, and I'm going to do blue science, which really, open up the tech tree here, really gets you the vast majority of the tech in the game, right? Like, so doing just red and yellow science, the first 2 science packs, they have names now. Automation science and logistics science gets you everything from automation, which is the first tech in the game, all of these techs here, all the way up to rocket fuel there. And then I was also doing military science, so I was getting all of these. But then blue science lets you get all this personal roboport stuff, lets you get the next 2 science packs unlocked, lets you get uranium processing and nuclear power, which is huge. And then a bunch more military upgrades as well. So yeah, you really get a lot more with the blue science pack, and especially you get personal roboports and some other good perks like that. So I was like, I want to do that this time. I'm going to make... speaking of research. So I decided to scale my yellow belt factory much bigger than I previously would have, which meant doing some oil processing early on. So these have obviously been been upgraded since they were initially built, but I started with just 10 oil processing, oil refineries here. You also need solid fuel for blue science packs now. I guess are they called chemical science packs? Can't even remember. Yeah, chemical science packs. Hey, I got that right. So I have solid fuel production here. That also feeds into to power. That's something that I never used to do, was solid fuel power. Again, something else I picked up from speedrunning. Over the course of balance changes over the past couple years, I think that coal power is really much less effective than it used to be. I don't think that was ever like one big nerf. It feels to me like it's just been a lot of small nerfs have made that happen. But anyway, solid fuel power is much more cost effective and like space effective to use. So that's my sort of mini setup there. I've also learned to use circuit networks in the past couple years of playing the game, so I now use this little trick, which I actually explained in my fluid handling basics video, to only run cracking of the different oil byproducts when I have a surplus of that particular byproduct. I'm producing a very small amount of lubricant here. I was only producing a tiny amount of it initially, and now I've scaled up a little bit more. And you can see here where I've had my don't be precious rule has come into effect, and I've just stuck little extra things in here, like making uranium explosive cannon shells. This has just been shoehorned in here later. Wasn't part of my initial build, but I knew I wanted to do a certain amount, so I knew I needed plastic at least, and solid fuel. So I got all that built. Oh, you also need bricks now for military science. I forgot about that. That's a good change. I like that. But I usually wanted bricks in this early factory anyway. But again, here you can see where I'm being like efficient in ways that I wouldn't in my previous builds, right? Where I actually thought like, okay, am I really going to need more than half of one belt of steel in this entire first factory that I'm building? No, because half of one belt of steel is a lot of steel, actually. Steel is a very like dense resource to produce that much of, and you don't you'd be surprised how much you can do with a relatively small amount in terms of belt space of steel. So I was, from the start with this bus, was thinking, okay, I'm just going to use half belts for some of these things like coal and stone and bricks and steel that I really don't need much of. And a lot of stuff I'm not even going to put on the bus. I do, however, put red circuits on the bus. This is a pretty modest red circuit factory. I'm early on, building this factory right at the start of the game. I don't want to take up a huge amount of space with it, but you can never have enough red circuits. And I think I've extended this a couple times over the course of the game, probably. I did also, the other big reason why for wanting to make my first base bigger than I've been making them before was to get robots earlier. Building the sort of the mid-game base, the red belt base, as it were, by hand, as I've been sort of used to doing, was kind of a tedious part of the game. I didn't love that ever. So getting roboports and some robot speed upgrades earlier, so that you can blueprint out your smelting stacks and stuff like that, and not have to build all that by hand for your mid-game factory. That was something I wanted to do. So that meant building a lot of engine units. Although actually, wait, no, this is I'm lying. Those engine units go somewhere else. Those engine units. Oh, this was blue science. That's what this was. I was confused by this rocket fuel here. This was originally where my chemistry science packs were being made, but later on in the game, I decided that actually what I wanted this to make was a bunch of rocket fuel for trains. So because I was already feeding solid fuel here to make chemical science, I just switched this over to rocket fuel production. Here, there was initially a branch taking the advanced circuits over here as well, but I cut that off to send advanced circuits elsewhere. This then is my robots build, so you can see like I built this from left to right, obviously. So made cogs, made circuits, made my first 2 tiers of science, then went off and built steel and brick production elsewhere, so that I could feed that here and make the 3rd science pack that I made, military science. Then I made the things that I needed for blue science, so advanced circuits, motor units, and solid fuel. And then immediately once I'd done that, I made my robot factory. So this whole thing makes basic motor units and feeds them into making electric motor units 1-to-1 because they take the same speed. Here's another area where there's like interesting things that I've learned from watching Factorio speedrunning. This little setup here, again, partly this is because this is quick to place down, right? You know, just like I was showing with the smelters, this is just like a little click and drag motion. Lots of like precise individual clicks aren't what you want to do when you're speedrunning. You want simple motions that let you build things quickly without requiring sort of super high precision all the time. But the other thing that I learned is that, which seems like a fairly elementary thing that I just didn't know, was that long-handed inserters are faster than basic inserters. I sort of had always assumed that just because they're moving over a longer distance that they must be slower, and therefore I'd always avoided using them and tended to use fast inserters pretty much everywhere as much as I could, and change my builds accordingly. But I learned that these are actually just quicker, which makes sense because they take more resources, significantly more resources than the just a regular inserter. So it makes sense that they're faster. So in situations like this, it makes sense to use a set of 4 here. It's actually like quicker to build and moves things quicker, gets you higher throughput. I'm also, I should say, in terms of efficiency stuff and planning, thinking more about like where I actually need to use fast inserters and where I don't. Like previously, I would have just built this whole thing with fast inserters, the moment I had them available. But for most stuff, you don't actually need that, right? Like engine units take 10 seconds to make. You never need that much inserter throughput to get them. Here I'm making batteries. Obviously, was making sulfuric acid down in my little chemical station down there. And this was my sort of robot build to make a bunch of robot frames, to make construction bots, and then also just a little cheeky, weird bit of spaghetti here to let me make robot ports. And I also found that I fortuitously had a bit of empty space here, and so I put some production in for some other things that I wanted. Accumulators. These chests weren't limited before. I had them left open to slowly build me up a lot of accumulators and a lot of solar panels over time, and also some laser turrets. Again, one of the benefits of going to this, the 4th tier of science in my first base was getting access to laser turrets, relatively speaking, a lot earlier than I would have in my other playstyles. And then once I built my robots, I built myself a little mall, just an area making all of the things that I wanted to have to be able to build my next tier of base. So this is something that I've kept with me. This is actually a combination of 2 blueprints that I used in that previous video that I made 2 years ago. This one on the right here builds all of the belt components for the 3 tiers of belts. When I initially placed this, I didn't have this 3rd tier of belts researched. And this thing is scaled to handle a much bigger throughput of cogs than I'm giving it with this base, but I don't really mind. This was actually more than enough alongside a single belt of cogs to produce belt as quickly as I needed it. It's now producing blue belt, but initially, but earlier on, this chest was much less limited and produced all the red belt that I needed for my second base. And then next to that, and attached to it now, these were 2 separate blueprints that I sort of combined with spaghetti, and then I've taken that blueprint with me through most of my games. This builds all the inserters. So this whole thing stamped down also makes repair packs for some reason, but makes a lot of the basic components that you need to build a base. Over here, I have a little factory to make level 1 modules and level 3 assembling machines. So that's a little bit of a weird thing that I've done. I sort of decided when I was doing the planning for this game and looking at how I was going to scale my second factory, which we will come to, I promise, I was thinking about what I wanted to build it with, and like in theory going by this idea of building a bigger belt, a bigger first base, and going up to the 4th tier of science in that first base would only give me access to the first 2 tiers of assembly machines. So these blue assemblers, which are what most of this base is made up with, and the first 2 tiers of modules. The ones that I'm using are productivity modules, which give you free stuff in exchange for energy consumption, and speed modules, which obviously speed things up, but are also necessary to make these assembly machine level 3s. And you can, the thing that made me decide to deviate from this strict plan a little bit was the fact that assembly machine level 2s can only hold 2 modules, which I will show you over here, right? This is an assembly machine level 2 making rocket fuel, can hold 2 productivity module level 1s, but assembly machine level 3 can hold 4. So I decided that I was gonna hand feed a couple of ad hoc crafting machines to make the 250 science packs or whatever it is that you need. Let's figure this out. There's automation 2. Where's automation 3? Somewhere else. I'm sure this makes for great viewing at the moment. Where's automation 3? Here it is. Yeah, so I made 150 production science packs in order to research automation 3 so that I could produce assembly machine 3s and build my red belt base using those. This is a sort of recent like balanced recipe change. The assembly machine 2s take steel now, and assembly machine 3s are slightly moved about in the tech tree, I think. I might be wrong about that. So yeah, so like that was my first base, and then this is the rest of my mall. So this is all sorts of stuff that you need a little bit of every now and then, but don't need a lot of all the time, right? Like belt, you need a lot of all the time. All this other stuff, you can just come and pick up a little bit every now and then, and it doesn't matter if it takes a while for it to refill. You know, even things like the components for your nuclear power plant, which require a huge amount of resources. It doesn't matter that you're feeding them pretty slowly in this base, because at least at the rate that I'm playing, obviously if you're, you know, playing for speed, you're gonna do things very differently, but don't play that quickly, so I'm fine with this sort of setup that slowly builds up to having a reasonable stockpile of components and buildings and structures and utility items. And I just have this at the end here, slowly turning all of my spare stone into landfill. I guess I'll go wrap up the last couple bits of this base that I didn't show in too much detail. I did stamp down some solar panels. You can see on the map here, there's a lot of solar panels up there that I built at some point. Just good in the mid-game as backup power. Yeah, I showed all my solid fuel power. Here's my very small stone build, brick build even, and that feeds into a lot of concrete. This has been expanded slightly since the start of the game, but because I had this mod that auto spreads concrete, actually spreads refined concrete. Partly that's because the guy who makes the concrete mod didn't update it as quickly as the guy who makes the refined concrete mod. So this concrete factory was sort of put in here fairly early on to make me lots of concrete and to start tiling the earth with stuff. But yeah, that's my first base. Let's go take a look at the nuclear plant next, actually, because even though I didn't build all of it, I did build most of it fairly early on. I like the new train interface a lot, by the way. So since I had oil processing early on, and since I had blue science early on, here, it just turned to nighttime, and you can see the lighting mod that I have installed. I've tweaked it a bit to not provide quite as much light, but basically poles light a small area around them. Let's hop on this train. Since I had sulfuric acid early, because I had chemical processing earlier than I usually did, I decided to stockpile a bit of it and start doing uranium mining. You get access to nuclear power with chemical science. You don't get access to Covarex enrichment, which helps you make your fuel go a lot further. But you do get access to uranium mining and uranium processing, so I built all of this fairly early on before I'd actually built my red belt base, because I knew that I was going to need a lot of power, right? I had this plan to use assembly machine level 3s. I'd use a lot more modules in them, level 1 modules, that is, in my sort of mid-game base than I usually would. So I knew I was going to need a lot of power to do that. Higher level assembly machines use a lot of power, modules use a lot of power, so I knew I was going to need nukes. So made this pretty sizable uranium processing thing. This Covarex enrichment plant came later. Here's my huge sink for unused depleted uranium, of which I have destroyed many times. In fact, I'll do that. Actually, no, I won't, because there's roboports there now. But yeah, this is the best analogy for nuclear waste that this game has. Actually processing waste material from your nuclear plants is very easy and very clean, but you do, as a byproduct of uranium mining, end up with just tons and tons of unusable uranium-238, which you periodically need to put into chests and destroy. So yeah, this whole nuclear plant was basically up and running. I stockpiled like 1,000 uranium-235 before I even had this set up. So I basically had everything up to this point here built very early on in the game. Was filling up this chest with uranium-235 early on, so that by the time I did build this nuclear plant, I had plenty of fuel for it. So I've mirrored it since then to provide twice the production. But see, this thing's humming along nicely. This is a blueprint that I picked up from FactorioBlueprints.com, I think, or that might not be the right URL, but from Factorio Blueprints, because the ratios for nuclear power are a little annoying, so I couldn't be bothered working it out myself, but this is a nice design. 8 reactors, 14 offshore pumps. Does very nicely. One of my very favorite things in the new patch is that trains now have conditions on whether there's a passenger present or not, so you can make your trains automatically leave the station when you get in them, even if they don't normally need to. Just take me back home. And before we get to the main part of the mid-game base, I'm going to show like an outpost of the mid-game base, because I decided to use trains earlier as well. I didn't use trains at all when I beat the game for the first time, but I've since sort of started using them a bit more, gotten more into the train system in this game, and as I was talking about earlier with this whole yellow base, red base, blue base concept that I've been playing with for a long time, I was making that blue base, that endgame base, very train heavy, doing that sort of mega base style that I've seen used a lot elsewhere, where you have distributed factories and trains that transport resources between them. So I decided to use that a bit in I just got out of my so bad. I sent my train away and then got out of it. I decided to do that in this game, and that's partly to do with the way the map gen settings have changed. I'll see if I can show this on the map a bit here, but just the way that resource deposits are placed has changed, and I tweaked the settings a lot. I've obviously got resource richness turned up a lot because mining out patches isn't too interesting to me. But I wasn't really going to find like all the resources in one place to make the factory the scale that I wanted to make it. So I decided, where is my train? It's on the way back. I decided to have some production separate from the main base for my on this playthrough for my red belt base, and I decided that it made the most sense for that to be green circuits, because you do need a lot of green circuits, and they take up a lot of copper plate and iron plate to make. And if you're making a sort of bus-based factory and making all of your green circuits on the bus, they're immediately going to eat up most of your copper and your iron. And that was kind of how I had always been building bases in the past, and it's, it works, but it means that your bus ends up then having a lot of wasted space on it in terms of like iron space for iron, belts full of iron that is never going to go anywhere because it's all being consumed by your green circuit production. So I decided to do it separately this time. So this whole area here, which like on the map you can see, it's a pretty significant area. Like this is my starting factory, right? This is everything that I just showed you. This over here is like pretty much as big in terms of space used, and much bigger in terms of resource throughput. And this is what's producing the green circuits for my mid-game factory. So this is, now we're up to using fast transport belts or red belts instead of just the early game transport belts. So these are twice as fast, and what I did was, find these patches of ore, decide, right, okay, over here in this area, there's a big iron patch and a big copper patch, and then a couple small iron patches. So I'm going to be able to do a lot of circuits with that. So I laid down all the miners, counted how many miners there were, which you can do easy using blueprint like this. Bam, see 254 miners there. And then use the Factorio calculator to, plug in the numbers of, okay, what's my mining productivity bonus at this point. At that point, it would have been 20%, I think. So how many full belts of ore am I going to get from this many miners? Okay, I'm going to build my balancers to balance me down from however many rows of miners I have. In this case, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, down to 5 belts, which is how many full belts I can actually get of ore out of that. And then I'm going to feed that into my smelting stacks. Each of these smelting stacks can turn 1 whole belt of iron ore into 1 whole belt of plates, and then I'm going to feed those into my big circuit factory. So here, this is scaled, again, using that Factorio calculator to produce 4 red belts of green circuits, just about. I've actually upgraded this later on to the 3rd tier of belts, to express transport belts, because it was slightly overscaled, just to make things throughput a bit quicker. But these were initially built with these, these assemblers, these modules. That hasn't been upgraded, this basic build. Here I have used probably overused inserters. I probably didn't quite this many. But I did, again, use the calculator to work out that an assembly machine level 3 with 3 productivity modules in it produces ever so slightly more copper wire than an assembly machine 3 with 4 productivity modules in it making circuits can consume. So this build lets you use 1 wire assembler to 1 circuit assembler, which makes it a lot more compact. And in this area, I also found I had a bit more iron than I needed, so I decided to also do cogs here. There's not quite enough, I think, iron coming in to make 3 full rows of cogs. I think I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 5 rows of iron coming in here. 5 rows of iron plates. You really need 6 rows of iron plates. So this is not quite enough production, I think. If I'm remembering right, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I did this better than I thought to make cogs. So this is sort of an outpost for my mid-game base. Got a little bit of coal mining way off down here. That's feeding all of this. You need very little coal. Coal is not very good for energy production, but still very, very good for feeding lots of smelters. And yeah, I built all of my own train network. I had been playing a lot using train network blueprint books, but this game I decided to build my own blueprint book for one. Here it is. It's called 17 Trains, because this is point 17. Got lots of cool train stuff in it. I don't know how super effective it is, but my goal was to build a train network that could sustain the kind of traffic that I would be having with my sort of theoretical late game base, whatever sort of scale that might be. I didn't actually plan for that when starting this game. I sort of planned my early game base and my mid game base, and was like, right, we'll get to the late game base when we get to it. Oh, that's why this stopped producing, because my train is blocking the station. We'll get in here and we'll scoot off somewhere else. So this outpost, this whole thing over here, which again is pretty much the same scale as my entire early game factory, is just to produce 2 of the things that I'm going to use at my mid-game base, my red belt base, which was scaled to sort of a pretty specific idea, and I'm really satisfied with how well it ends up balancing around that specific idea, and I'll show you what that is once I get to it. So you can see this train network is pretty chunky, right? Like the basic units that I'm laying down is this 4-lane thing. So 2 lanes in each direction, and the stations have a lot of capacity for stacking up multiple trains. This is a bit less tidy than this, but that's okay. So yeah, again, this is sort of in order to carry a lot of traffic later on in the game, in theory. We'll try my best not to get run over by a train. This was all initially made with red belts, with fast belts instead of with express belts. I've upgraded it later again just to get squeeze the most green circuits through as I possibly can. This is one bit of my my blueprint book that I need to change. I don't quite know what I thought I was doing here. I mean, I do know what I think I was doing here, but I don't know why I thought it would do what I wanted. It's sort of trying to unload trains, right? And
this is something I learned very early on was, like, you want to have stack inserters, in this case filter stack inserters, unloading your train into crates, because that's like the quickest way to move resources off the train. Just like get the train empty so that you can get it out the way. That's the way to maximize throughput. And then from there you want to get your resources onto belts, so you feed each crate from a stack inserter into a belt, but then you need to pair your belts up because inserters only feed onto one side of the belt, so you need to pair your belts up so that you have both sides of the belt full. And then you have an odd number of belts from your train, right? Because you're always going to have 3 to a side. So here I was like, I have, 9, I have 18 belts and I want to get down to 4 belts. Like, how can I do that? And I was like, it's 4.5, right? So I'll do 4 into 1, and then I'll take half of the 5th one. That's what I'm trying to do here, right? You can see I've gone 1, 2, 3, 4. These all go into this 4-to-1 balancer. And then what I'm trying to do here is add in like a 5th of this one, I think, to this. It doesn't work. I don't know why I thought it would work. It ends up not mattering because it just means that these 2 crates, or these 4 crates, I should say, because it's mirrored on the other side of the train, empty quickest, but it doesn't impact the throughput at all. Anyway, these are the perils of making your own blueprint book. But still, I'm glad that I did it. So this is my mid-game base. It's pretty big. We'll go around the outskirts first. So the sort of anchor point for this entire base is this red circuit factory, which is very, very big. Red circuits, or advanced circuits, that what they're called? Yeah, advanced circuits are like one of the first, or I don't know, not one of the first, but they are one of the real bottlenecks in the game that you're likely to encounter as a casual player, I would say. Like, things early in the game are pretty easy to make in large quantities. It's not that hard to figure out how to scale up, iron cog production or basic circuit production to the levels that you're going to need it in the early game. But it's very easy to build things that consume red circuits quite quickly, advanced circuits quite quickly, and it's very hard to make a lot of advanced circuits. They just, take a long time, take a lot of resources to make. So I did a bunch of, punching numbers into Factorio Calculator and trying to figure stuff out, and decided on this build, based on using assembly machine 3s, productivity module 1s, trying to sort of figure out, okay, like, how many assembly machine 3s with prod 1s can I fill from how many, like, assembly machines making copper wire, what's the ratio there? And I was like, okay, so I can do 2 of those making wire to 30 of these making circuits. Okay, and then how many of those do I want to stack? And then, figured out eventually that I wanted 6 of these double stacks of 30 to make a total of, how many is this? It's a big number. Yes, 360 assembly machines, all making advanced circuits. And that makes about, I think, 1.6 red belts. So, around like 50 a second. You can see down here, we'll get to the balancer, yeah. So you can see in the end I'm producing not quite 2 belts, some way short of 2 full belts of red circuits there, but definitely a lot more than 1 belt. You couldn't fit all this on 1 belt, so that's good. So this was the thing that I had in my mind, when I was making that whole early game factory. It was like, what do I need in order to make this huge, crazy red circuit build that I have in mind to try and make an amount of red circuits that's going to satisfy my lust for production. So this set of green circuit manufacturing is just to feed that red circuit build. Again, that red circuit build is scaled to fit nicely in like a couple of ways. I sort of tweaked the numbers until I got a couple of key things the way that I wanted them to be. One of those things was this uses exactly 2 belts of green circuits. You can see these belts are both full and they're both moving all the time. There's no backing up at all. We're using exactly 2 red belts of green circuits to make this. So yeah, I have dedicated green circuit production just going into this. I obviously need a lot of plastic to do that. We're going to head up over here. The past a bunch of other things to get to my plastic. So here we have a bunch of iron refining. This is, you know, exactly the same setup as over here at my outpost. Same type of build. You know, built by robots. I've deconstructed all the roboports, but I should say, like, that was the you know, the big advantage of doing this bigger early game factory, having this big robot build, was that this outpost and then this whole factory was built by robots, with minimal effort from me. It's still using a build that is would be fairly easy to lay out by hand, but it's just, you know, the repetition gets boring. So here's my oil refinery, for my late game base, built right next to this big oil patch. Got 40 refineries here. This is basically just the same as my other refinery, but scaled up, honestly. Like, it's really very similar. Oh, things are getting attacked. We'll deal with that later. I'm not too worried about it. We'll get to it. But, you know, needed a lot of plastic. Not that much sulfuric acid. Again, sort of getting smarter with this base in a big way. It's one of the big differences between this base and the base I made a video about a couple years ago, is that I thought, you know, looked much more into how much of things do I actually need. And so this small sulfuric acid build reflects that, right? Like, you don't need that much sulfuric acid. You can get away with a build that's this small. You don't need to build sort of a big crazy thing with tons of production, which is what I would sort of do by default always before, just because I was like, well, the smallest you can possibly build is like 20 assemblers making any given thing. Like, no, you can actually be smarter than that, be more efficient than that. Shouldn't say smarter, right? Like, I still think that it's perfectly valid to play Factorio any way you want to play. We're going to run through the base to turn off this alarm, because otherwise it's going to annoy me. We'll run on this belt because it's fast. We'll talk about biters a bit later. I guess might as well talk about biters now. One of the, you know, things that's changed a lot in the map gen settings is the way that the initial biter bases are set up, the way that biter spread works, pollution works has been tweaked a bit. The map that I played the last time I made a video about Factorio had very different biter settings. They were much more I had spread turned on, basically, still. So I think I had them on their lowest possible starting settings, like, so you can set the sort of an exclude, when you generate the map, you can set your starting area, which is like an exclusion zone basically around your starting position, and how big you want that to be. So in that area there will be no enemy bases, and then you can set how frequent you want the enemy bases to be, and how big you want them to be, and how dense, quote unquote, you want them to be. Those were the old settings, and so I had them when I made my previous video on the lowest possible settings for starting position, but I did have expansion turned on. I stopped playing with expansion at a certain point. It started to annoy me that I would have to clear out areas multiple times. So I would have the biters set to be, you know, a fairly decent threat and something that I would have to deal with, but wouldn't have to deal with more than once. Once I cleared out a base, it was gone and that area was safe. When they changed the map gen settings, I really didn't take enough time to get a good handle on what biter settings were going to be the ones that I wanted to use, and partly that's because that's something that takes kind of a whole game to see, because it's not until you get to a big factory producing a lot of pollution that you get a feel for what your biter life is really going to be like. And I ended up not really satisfied in this game. Like, I had a previous game on this patch that I aborted because it was just too easy as far as biters went, and so they're a bit turned up on this, but they're still just too sparse. And I think maybe what I need to do for future playthroughs is turn expansion back on, and maybe tone it down a bit. I don't know. Anyway, back to the base. So this was my bus starting for my mid-game base, sort of things that I knew I was going to make and put on here. Green circuits are coming from the train that I showed you before, as are the cogs. And we have 4 lanes of iron. We have 2 lanes of copper. We don't actually quite have 2 lanes of copper. I had, had the copper patches that I had at the time that I built this. Since then, and I've got some more mining productivity upgrades, so I could scale this up, but I haven't done that yet. So I had sort of 5 belts of copper here, and I needed 2 for red circuits, and I needed 3 for green circuits for red circuits, which left me with I need like 2 and a bit, which left me with just like 1 and a bit for the 2 lanes that I wanted for my factory. So you can see that's a little bit undersupplied, but still doing okay. Anyway, and then I also made a full belt of steel. I have a lot of steel production. I don't think I'm using all of it, but here it is. This will produce one full express belt of steel, still overscaled there, and one belt of plastic is also coming in here. Use that for some things later on. Let's put my night vision back on so I can show you my base better. So with this base, I built things in kind of a weird order. It's not, I guess, that organized, but you know, I knew I wanted to build a bunch of science first. So here's the basic science. You'll notice that like this isn't a vastly scaled up science build to the science build in my first base. In my first base, I obviously started with assembly machine level 1s and went up to assembly machine level 2s with 2 productivity modules in them, and I have here 12 making green science, 10 making red science. And over here, I have the same number of assembly machines. They are a level up, and they have more productivity modules in them, but I haven't scaled up that much. I'm not that interested in producing science super quickly at this point in the game. Like, it just doesn't make that much difference. And again, it's partly that sort of recognizing my own playstyle, right? I don't play this game super fast. I play fairly slowly and in a relaxed way, so it's okay to make a base that doesn't produce stuff, you know, doesn't churn through all the science incredibly quickly for me. Like, I'm fine with that. So the first things in this base are making science packs. You know, we have the first, we have your basic ones, your red and green, then you have your chemistry science, your military science. These are duplicating things that I did on my first base. Then we come to some new ones. We have purple packs, which are production science. Yeah, and so that requires a pretty sizable build for productivity modules level 1. This is actually a much bigger build than you need, and we'll see later on why I've got such a big prod 1 build here. Some viewers may be able to guess. Oh, more biters. Interesting. And then we have my purple circuit build. We can see here we're starting to run a little bit low on red circuits. This factory was actually humming along pretty nicely before. It's sort of gotten out of balance a bit, which is upsetting me ever so slightly. We'll see if it comes back into balance by the time we get to the end. But yeah, this is making all of the things we need for the final science pack, High Tech Science, which takes advanced circuits. This is a much bigger advanced circuit build than I've done before. Not colossal, because you don't need a ton of these, but pretty deliberately scaled. Spoilers up here. You need robot frames for those as well. You need low density structures. So this is really the thing that I scaled this whole factory around in some ways, was building productivity module level 3s. Oh, we're actually about to fill this chest up. Wow, it just happened. I've sort of learned in previous playthroughs doing this yellow base, red base, blue base style, where with my blue base, right, my end game level, my mega base, quote unquote, the way that I wanted to build it was using the best of everything. So using the highest level assembly machines and using the highest level modules, using lots of beacons with lots of speed modules in them. And I discovered that producing enough productivity module level 3s to build that kind of base is really hard, because they're really slow to build. Each prod module 3 takes 60 seconds to make, and takes 5 reds and 5 blues. But they also take 5 productivity module level 2s, and those take 5 reds and 5 blues. So you can see like things stack up, and those, you know, take prod 1s, which take blues and greens. So really, really stacks up. So actually getting all 8 of these factories making productivity modules level 3s takes a huge amount of infrastructure, and that was basically what this whole factory was scaled around. I sort of started from, I want to have 8 factories always making prod 3s, and worked back from that basically to get this red circuit build. And then once I had that, sort of started thinking, okay, well, with the leftovers from this, how much science could I make? How much of other products will I need to make that much science in a balanced way? And then once I'd done that, I sort of realized, like, well, if I fudge it a little bit more, I could get the rocket, right? And I don't actually need that much more to make the rocket happen. Like, the scale of production that you need to make this happen is bigger than the scale of production you need to launch the rocket in a modest amount of time. So I decided to. This wasn't initially part of my plan for this base. Usually I would do rocket launching in my end game base. But I decided to just build the rocket. Why not? I have the things to make it. So I extended this low density structure build for which you need some of for the high tech science packs a bit, and I added a build to make rocket fuel over here, and I added a little cheeky extra bit of advanced circuit production over here to also feed a bit of speed module production and to feed rocket control unit production, and I built my rocket silo. And again, I tried to do it with like planning and balancing, so I knew what rate I was producing science at from all of these things, and you can see I'm doing it pretty evenly. All of my factories are working making these ones, all of my factories are working making these guys. We're not using military science at the moment, so those guys are idle, but all of these factories are working as well, so I'm very balanced on science consumption. That's great. So I knew how much how much of each of those science packs I was making, so I worked out using Factorio calculator what rate I needed to be launching rockets at to make military science at the same rate, and I've achieved that balance very accurately. I'm really pleased with how balanced things are here. I'm actually finally starting to fall behind a little bit on low density structures for my rocket here. It hasn't quite caught up, but you can see I don't have some backup. I don't have any backup of space science. The only backup is sort of on this belt here, which is a pretty modest thing. It's obviously not perfectly balanced, so the longer this has been running, the more gradually it's been building up imbalances in different areas, but it was initially, or at least for a while, very balanced. And one of my proudest sort of reflections of that is, looking at this power chart, you can see at this sort of period here is when I really feel like I had everything in the factory running and it was all super balanced, and we're still mostly in that. Everything is running, everything is operating. It's not like in here you can see where it's very sort of sawtooth, right, where things are turning on and turning off and turning on and turning off. I managed to achieve a fairly steady state. Obviously there are still some peaks and valleys, but generally everything in my factory at a time at least was working and working smoothly and working in an even and balanced way. And so I kind of decided that it was done. I kind of decided that I didn't want to actually build the late game mega base. I've got some of the infrastructure, right? I have the beginnings of this train network that I could extend outwards, and I've been saving up all of these modules that I've been producing, and I've got a stockpile of electric furnaces and stuff over here, and back over at my initial base I've got all these beacons that I've been making, and all these assembly machines level 3 that I've been making, and all this railway line and railway infrastructure that I've been making, and I've got this huge nuclear factory that's producing more electricity than I need, and that I could easily expand to be more nuclear reactors and stuff. But I'm just kind of happy. I just kind of like this factory. I finished it and I launched the rocket. I've now launched how many? 19? And most of the time since I launched the rocket that I've been in the game, which was at 30 hours, like I said. I don't know if I can see now what my clock is at. Does it show it down here? No, it doesn't. Doesn't show it there either. I guess, I can get a rough idea here. Yeah, so I'm up to what? 34 hours? Something like that. So yeah, since I launched the rocket, I've kind of just gone full into bonsai tree mode with this factory, which is a term that people use a lot for this kind of game. Which I hadn't really experienced as much before now, but just being okay, yeah, this thing just kind of basically works, and I can trim little things here and tweak little things there, upgrading these belts a bit to help this throughput slightly, and some things like that. But I'm thinking about maybe making explosive production, a little thing like that. But generally just being yeah, I'm satisfied with this factory. I'm satisfied with how it's turned out. I'm satisfied with how balanced it was, at least for a while there. We're now going to start backing up because this chest is full up. And since this tiny little stack of machines drives so much of the factory, once it's no longer running, things will start to tail off slowly back throughout the rest of the factory. But yeah, that's my new factory. We're not going to get a rocket launch in this video, just like we didn't get one in the previous video. But Factorio 0.17, it's great. You should play it.